Welcome, everyone, to this Good Leadership Podcast. My name is Charles Good, your host and the president of the Institute for Management Studies. This podcast is designed to provide you with actionable insights and strategies that you can apply from discussing the research of esteemed leadership experts and practitioners to take your leadership to the next level. My goal is what we discuss today will be immediately actionable and useful to you, and I'd love to hear your comments for this episode about what you're planning on implementing. My guest today is Dr. Andrew Shatté, who is the founder and president of the Phoenix Life Academy. He is a fellow with the Brookings Institution, where he facilitates programs for high-level audiences from the Department of Defense, Homeland Security, IRS, NASA, CIA, and all branches of the military. He's also served as an adjunct assistant professor of psychology at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Shatté has devoted his career to understanding the psychological aspects of motivation, leadership, and resilience, and to developing programs to optimize human performance in a wide array of arenas, including the workplace, in health, academics, and in sports. He is also the co-author of two best-selling books, meQuilibrium and The Resilience Factor, which is going to be the focus of today's program and one of my favorite practical how-to guides on the topic. Welcome to the program, Andrew.
Charles, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to be here.
I'd like to start off by you providing our listeners a little insight into your background and what really got you interested in studying resilience.
It's a great question, Charles. And we all have origin stories, right? And mine begins back in college when dinosaurs ruled the earth, born and raised in Australia. And I started out studying law, which is an undergraduate degree in Australia, but apparently that was too lucrative for me. So I shifted to a degree in political science, which was apparently too practical for me. And I ended up graduating with a degree in philosophy. So you can imagine the myriad of job possibilities that were open to me upon graduation. In fact, the only job I could get was a job in the Australian government, and it was the Department of Social Security. So it became my job to interview people who'd just been fired or downsized from their jobs. And so I'm watching day in and day out as people went through this major life calamity. And I began to see that some got up, dusted themselves off, went out to try to find a job, whereas others languished and became helpless and hopeless. So for me, that began my lifelong, or at least career-long, interest in the concept of resilience, since it is resilience that's the differentiator there, and it's such an important part of all of our lives. So that was mid-'80s, began studying resilience part-time, and since 1992, from graduate school on, been interested in studying resilience full-time. It's a fascinating topic, and I know that you're a big fan of the topic, really hoping to get other people interested in this as well.
So resilience is composed of 7 abilities, according to your book and your studies. They are emotional regulation, impulse control, empathy, optimism, causal analysis, self-efficacy, and reaching out. And all of these 7 factors can be measured, taught, and improved. Which one of these would you suggest everyone starting with?
Emotion control, emotion regulation for sure, because without that factor in place, it's really difficult to develop the other 6. Now, I have an inside track on this because emotion regulation is my weakest of the 7 by far, always has been and continues to be so. But as you said, just as each and every one of these 7 factors can be measured, they can also be boosted. And what my colleagues and I have found is that there are thinking styles, which I know we'll get into, that we develop across the course of our lives. And it's those thinking styles that either boost or get in the way of each one of these 7 factors. So once we understand the thinking style that gets in the way of, say, emotion regulation, which I do put at the base of the pyramid of the 7 factors, then we can start to develop skills to get around the most problematic edges of those thinking styles, to get more emotion regulation. And once we have that in place, then the other 6 factors are achievable as well.
So we're going to get into emotional regulation here in a minute with the ABCs, but you had mentioned too that the foundation of these 7 skills of resilience is built on the realization, which I think is important for everyone to know, that our emotions and behaviors are triggered not by the event themselves, but by how we interpret the events that happen to us.
Absolutely. And this is not my idea. This idea goes back to the ancient Greek philosophers. We could name a number of them. Epictetus was one. Marcus Aurelius, a Roman, was another. We know that this is the model of stoicism. And the key principle here is that It is what we think that determines what we feel and what we do. So if we want to get systematic, systemic change in what we're doing and what we're feeling, in other words, our resilience, then what we need to do is to start upstream. We need to start to look at how we think and the styles we develop in how we think.
I would agree with that. And let's now move then to the ABCs, because that really speaks to emotional regulation. So love this part of the book, have used it, know it's effective. You know it's effective, obviously, it's worked for thousands. But you first need to know yourself before you're in a position to change. And ABCs, it's an acronym. The first letter, A, starts with adversity. What adversities cause the greatest problems? Pay attention to what they have in common and focus on providing the who, what, when, and where of the situation, which in your book you give a survey to help people kind of identify, right, where the problem areas, the adversity areas of their life are.
Really important that we get the who, what, when, and where, because if we do that, then we're starting to look at this like a detective or a scientist would, and we're trying to be objective. What actually happened versus what is our perception of what happened. I could say to someone like, why are you so upset right now? And they might answer, well, that person really disrespected me. But that is in part fact and in part perception. So what we want is just the facts. And the facts would be something like, well, he or she said X, Y, Z. And what did you think about that? Well, I thought that was kind of disrespectful. Now we can start to take a close look at the thinking and whether it was in fact disrespectful or not. And if it is, it's going to lead to anger. If it's not, then the anger is going to subside. This is where we start to get more emotion regulation, because we're helping people respond to the facts of their adversity rather than smushing together the facts and their perception.
And it's also important to be objective and specific. Don't put in your beliefs to this. Just state the facts, use that framework to identify those. The next one, the B, which we don't go in order because it's A, C, then B when you're doing this. Well, let's talk about the B briefly, and that's those ticker tape beliefs. So you must listen to what you're saying to yourself when it occurs. Ask yourself, what are you thinking about right now after this event happened, correct?
Exactly right. We do know that there are these activating events or adversities, and they do cause certain thoughts to go through our heads. Certain beliefs will come up in the wake of that adversity. And then it's those beliefs that have the impact on our emotions and our behavior. We think it's the event or the adversity, but it really isn't. Hidden underneath that in our largely unconscious or subconscious minds are a chain of thinking or ticker tape beliefs that run through our head. And it's those that really propel the emotion and the behavior. So if we want to behave in ways that are more resilient, if we want to get more emotion regulation, we have to start getting those B's out on the table, out of the subconscious into consciousness. And we will see patterns. We're going to see patterns because each and every one of us develops styles in how we think.
So there's two really categories of these beliefs. There's the causal why beliefs, and then there's the what next beliefs. But let's first unpack a little bit of those why beliefs. So do you ask yourself why questions when an outcome is unexpected, right?
Yes, or even any adversity, even if we sort of expected it. There have been so many studies done where they look at people who've been through an adversity, big or small, and what is the first thing that they tend to do? And the first thing that humans tend to do is to say, why did this happen? We are basically hardwired to look for a cause, and that's very adaptive because then we can start problem solving. Once we identify the cause, we can start to think about the fix. The problem here is that we develop our own style of answering that question. So we may not answer the question in a way that's accurate. We're going to answer it in a way that's stylized. And that's going to lead us to commit the same mistake over and over and over again. And it's going to lower our resilience. So just as you asked me, what's the most important factor? And my answer was emotion regulation. I would say then comes causal analysis or problem solving. And the answer to that why question is what either makes us good problem solvers or not.
Thank you for that. That why belief really talks to and speaks to our explanatory style. Everyone should understand their explanatory style because when adversity strikes, the causal beliefs you generate will reflect this style, preventing you to see a full range of the causes of the problem. So I'd like to unpack that a little bit, that we have three dimensions of this. It's me versus not me. And that's, do you blame yourself or others, correct?
Yes.
And then always, not always. Do you see the problem as fleeting or permanent? And everything versus not everything. Do you believe that the cause will undermine everything else in your life? Or is it specific to one adversity? So speak to us and unpack this a little bit more of how this affects your beliefs and thinking. And is there a right explanatory style or a preferred way of going about it?
It's the most studied thinking style in the entire world. And there have been literally hundreds of thousands of journal articles published globally on this concept of explanatory style, or the thinking style we develop around what's causing the problems in our lives. There are three dimensions: me, not me, always, not always, everything, not everything. And just as an example, we do a lot of work with kids. And let's say we're working with kids who are struggling with math. We may ask them, why do you think you're failing math? And we'll always find some kids who'll say, it's because I'm stupid. Now, we never accept that at face value, but were we to, we could see that that's a me belief. It's something inside of them. It's also an always, because smarts doesn't change very quickly. It doesn't change on a dime. It's likely to be forever. And it's not just affecting math. Stupid affects everything in their life, which is very different than if they said, I'm just really bad at math, which is a me, always, not everything. It just applies to math. On the other hand, we'll have some kids who'll say, this teacher's exams are just too hard. It's a not me, it's about the teacher. It's a not always, they're going to be done with the teacher at the end of the year. And it's a not everything, because it's only affecting this element of their life. So we see that there are different consequences, big life consequences, in terms of depression, anxiety, performance, happiness, depending on which style you happen to develop. And we do know that these styles are handed down from parent to child. So by the time the child is about 10, 11, 12, this explanatory style is largely set. Now, to answer the other really important question that you asked, there isn't really any great style. The fact is that they're all limiting, because they lead us to a subset of the causes of our problems, rather than allowing us to see all of the possible causes, all the me's, the not me's, the always, the not always, and everything in between. So these styles are limiting and we want to get around them, but there are some that are particularly harmful. And those that involve the always and everything style lead people to bog down in their problem solving, because their first instinct is to get attracted to those causes, which by definition are going to be around forever and affect everything they do. So they're putting this cause outside of their sphere of influence and outside of their ability to control it. If they happen to be a me person on top of it, depression is a very likely outcome. If they happen to be a not me person like me, then anger and frustration is going to be more of the dominant emotion. But in either way, they're not going to be good problem solvers, and you cannot be resilient without that capacity.
Thank you for that. That's so important to know and to unpack. Even though it's a common term, to know your explanatory style means that you know where you're directing your solutions toward, and you realize that you're not seeing all the solutions. And also it speaks to the effects of it. So if you're a me person where everything's an internal locus of control, greater depression. If you're a not me, maybe you suffer from the victim mentality because everything's outside your control and you're a victim to it. So important to know and what you are predisposed to, so you can counteract those effects when solving problems and becoming more resilient. Now, this speaks to the why beliefs. The what next beliefs is what's going to happen next. These are oriented more toward the future, right? To what they think is going to happen given the situation at hand.
Exactly. This is the 3 a.m. phenomenon, right, Charles? You wake up in the middle of the night, got all of these thoughts going through your head about how terrible things are going to be in the future. And we all experience this, but for some people, it can be an almost nightly occurrence. And that is because their tendency is to focus more on what are the consequences of the adversity that's happened to me today. And they can spiral out of control. It can lead to, really behavior freezing levels of anxiety and fear. And so we definitely want to make sure that we're helping people see the most likely outcomes rather than the most deadly. This is the problem that people have. We confuse what is most horrible with what is most likely. And we spend 99% of our problem-solving capacity worrying about dreadful eventualities that have a 1 in a million chance of occurring. In the meantime, we're not actually problem-solving those things over which we can exert some control. So we definitely want to help people get a sharper focus on that. And all of this is about getting more accurate about your thinking, no matter what that thinking style may happen to be.
Those what next beliefs too, a lot of people that are predisposed to those versus the why beliefs, they suffer from anxiety, right? Fear, and you overweight the negative consequences a great deal, like you just mentioned, so that it's getting that realization, that idea that, okay, here's my predisposed style. Now it's going to talk to me about my thinking style, so I can see some of the errors, some of the areas in which I'm always focusing on to help me correct those, to course correct. Or with the what next, for a person, do you see them preferring one or the other, or can they be equally adept at both? Meaning, if when adversity strikes, do you see them always reverting to a why belief? Why is this happening to me? And then in other cases, they might say, well, what's next? How do they play together? And can the same person have both of those or be predisposed to both of those?
Most of us do both, but we tend to have a major and a minor.
Okay.
And for those people who tend to be scanning more for why did this happen? Why did this happen? They tend to be more rear view people. So they're sitting there looking at past events and thinking, why? And that doesn't leave the same kind of bandwidth to be looking at the road ahead and asking yourself the question, what next? And there are others who don't spend a lot of time on the why. They will spend some, but not a lot. And their proclivity is to go straight into what's going to be the consequence of this. So really, you do find that most people can say, hey, I'm more of an anger and frustration person, which means they're more of a why question person. And those who say, no, that's not really me. I'm way more of an anxiety person. I can identify that as my signature go-to emotion. And that means they live much more in the what next. We all do both, but most of us do one fairly predominantly.
Thank you for that clarification. I think that's helpful. So the final letter in the ABCs is the consequences. When you're doing this exercise, first identify the adversity, then skip over B, go to the consequences, because they're usually easier to identify, because you can then see the emotion and the behavior that's following this adversity. Then you backtrack into the belief, because sometimes those beliefs aren't evident to you. But these BC couplets are pretty universal. So I'd like for you to unpack first a little bit about the consequences. Then let's go into some of these couplets so people can really work backward from C into identifying what those beliefs are a result of.
Yeah, well, the ABC model was originally the creation of the late and great psychologist Albert Ellis. Our contribution to his model was to say, okay, well, what exactly are these C's, these consequences that tend to get in the way of our happiness and productivity and performance? In other words, our resilience. And what we came up with was the big 7. There are 7 big emotions that tend to get in the way of our emotion regulation and therefore get in the way of our resilience. And they are anger, anxiety, frustration, sadness, guilt, embarrassment, and shame. And for each one of those emotions, there's a very specific thought that leads to it. So in the case of anger, it's because we have a thought that our rights have been violated. Whereas anxiety, as we've discussed, is much more about future threat, the what next piece. Frustration is when we have the belief that we don't have the resources we need to get a job done. Sadness comes about because of thoughts about loss. And so often when we're in the workplace and confronted with change, we focus on what that change is going to rob us of. And that's going to lead to sadness. In the case of guilt, and my wife is a maestro at this, in the case of guilt, it's around thoughts that you violated the rights of another, embarrassment that you've lost standing in front of other people, and shame, the final of the 7, is about failing to meet your own standards of how you should be in the world. Now, the fact is that each and every one of us develops in childhood a radar a way of scanning our world. We call that an emotion radar. And it's going to be one of those sorts of belief systems. I'm scanning for violation of rights. I'm scanning for future threat. I'm scanning for loss. And what we know is that people tend to have one that dominates. So they can say, I'm an anger person. I can say, well, that's because you've learned to scan for violation of rights. I'm an embarrassment person. That's because your tendency in any given situation is to look for how you may be losing standing in front of others. Now, that's a breakthrough, right? Because once we understand what our emotion radar is and our signature emotion that follows from it, we can start to get really vigilant in these moments where we're experiencing the emotion. We can say to ourselves, hey, look, I'm getting angry right now, but is that because there's been a real violation or just my radar pinging on something imaginary? This is the breakthrough thing for a lot of people, because once they start to do this, they're living without that emotion 9 times out of 10. And so they get that emotion regulation boost, their resilience goes up. We're going to talk about this in the workshop, of course, but one of the things that we see is that once you get emotion regulation improved, you're going to see improvements on a whole range of other things. Your perception of good versus bad events, your productivity, your sense of psychological capital or hope and optimism, your physical health, all of these things get buoyed without even directly targeting them if we can just get emotion regulation in place.
I completely agree with you. Those BC connections are the foundation of self-awareness. And by listening to your ticker tape, you can make sense of or even predict what emotions and behaviors will follow. And then you can separate those. Is this really a violation of my rights, like you said, with anger, or is this perception incorrect? And they are really important, like you state, for 2 reasons. Use them to disentangle your mixture of emotions that you experience when faced with adversity, or to identify the beliefs that are causing you to get stuck in a particular emotion. By gaining that understanding of why you're reacting that way, then you learn emotional regulation. You learn to keep your bearings, correct?
Absolutely.
So now that we have this model, A, B, and C, and those ticker tapes, those are your beliefs in the moment about an adversity, and that drive your emotions and behaviors. Now, these ticker tape beliefs, they can be surface beliefs, float on the surface of your awareness, which we don't want that to mean or connote that they're superficial or irrelevant. In most situations, these surface beliefs hold the key to the reasons you react the way you do. But sometimes these ticker tapes beliefs don't explain your reactions. In this case, you're not responding to your ticker tape beliefs, but to the underlying beliefs, these fundamental deep-rooted beliefs about who you are and your place in the world. And you call those iceberg beliefs.
Absolutely. And this does happen quite a bit. I had an event just a few months ago where I came into the house from outside and I was furious. And my wife could tell that I was furious. I'm talking about anger at a 9 or a 10. And she looked and was like, what's up? And I said, you're not going to believe what our neighbor has gone and done. And judging by my level of emotionality, she must have thought that he kidnapped one or both of our kids. And then I said out loud, he's done it again. He's parked his car in front of our house. And even as I was saying it, I realized, okay, maybe this is a minor violation of my rights, but it's a violation at a 1 or a 2, if anything. And it doesn't explain why I'm now angry at an 8 or a 9. And in those moments, we want to go under the covers, down through the water to find the iceberg. And we call them icebergs because they're very big. They have a big impact on our emotions. They take something that should be a 1 or a 2 on the emotional scale and make it an 8 or a 9. And they're largely unconscious, just like most of an iceberg is below the level of the water. And in this case, it's an iceberg that I've had for many, many, many years, since I was a kid. And it is, I should be respected and supported by all people at all times. So for me, this wasn't so much about a car parking incident. For me, this was a matter of basic human respect. And once we realized that my poor neighbor unwittingly violating one of my major icebergs, then we get why the emotion was so high. And now this is liberating, because we also know we don't want to live our lives by these icebergs. We form them when we're kids. They're immature, they're ill-conceived, They are black and white in a world of gray. They lack nuance, and they don't work in an adult world. So we want to start chipping away at that iceberg, keep the positive value aspect of it, but make it workable and real in the adult world. And once we do that, we see big benefits in terms of resilience.
So the first step is to identify your ABCs, but after you've mapped the ABCs, check those BC, the belief consequence connections. And there are three issues you mentioned to focus on. One, check whether the C's are out of proportion with the B's. So your consequences, like what you just described in that great example, are just blown out of proportion. They don't make sense with the B's, the beliefs. Two, check whether the quality of your C is mismatched with the category of your B's. Do you feel sad, even though your ticker tape suggests anger? And then three, check whether you're struggling to make a seemingly simple decision, because that could also be representative of an iceberg belief, correct?
Absolutely. And you're right about the mismatch between the kind of thought and the emotion. These couplets are invariant. If you're experiencing anger, you have had a thought about violation, but it may not be the major piece of the puzzle. I remember working with a gentleman. He and his wife had just become empty nesters. He fancied himself as something of a handyman. He was putting up a set of blinds in the last kid to leave's bedroom and make it into a quiet reading room. And he was drilling it up, and he stepped back to admire his handiwork just as his wife came around the corner to admire it as well. And they could both see that it was hopelessly lopsided. And he got furious with the situation and went into his garage and started tinkering with an old car that was there and blew off all the plans they had for that afternoon. So obviously not a really adaptive and productive response. But my first thought was, okay, he's experienced anger. It must be about violation of rights. But actually what was happening was he had built up an iceberg belief based on the internalized messages from his dad, which was a real man can do these handyman things. And so for him, in that moment, he felt like he wasn't meeting his own standards of how he should be in the world unknowingly. And so in that moment, he experienced shame. We saw that failing to meet our own standards is going to lead to shame. He also experienced sadness through a loss of sense of self-worth because he was unconsciously evaluating his self-worth against this yardstick. And then he took this great sadness, which he didn't really have the propensity to express, and twisted that into anger. But unless we got down to the bottom, to those iceberg beliefs, we would never have understood his response. And once we did, even he said, oh my goodness, a real man must be the kind of person who can tack up a set of blinds. He's like, that's my dad talking to me from beyond the grave. And I know it's not true. I've proven my worth as a human being. I've supported my family. I've got kids in college. I've done what I need to do. It's got nothing to do with blinds. And then he could start to work on bringing that iceberg down, melting it, to use the language that we do.
That's a great example. And that's why it's so important to really have that self-realization, to have that self-awareness, right? To identify where are these beliefs coming from? Because I found that when an adversity strikes, there is a mixture of emotions. There might be a dominant emotion, like you stated, or you're predisposed to one type of consequence or emotion, but a lot of time there's secondary ones, and really getting to the root cause requires that level of self-examination. So after you're finishing with the ABCs, then you really should be looking closely at your beliefs to check those ticker tape beliefs for thinking traps. However, after a while, you'll find you fall usually into one, two, or three of those traps more frequently, correct?
Absolutely. There are 7 of them that we've been able to identify. They really get in the way of impulse control or focus, which is one of the big 7 factors that make up resilience. But the great news is that we can help people, as we will in the workshop, find their way to the 1 or 2 they tend to make most often. And then we have a very concrete and specific prescription for getting out of that thinking trap moving forward. So for me, for example, I have 2 that are really dominant. I tend to externalize blame, and I tend to overgeneralize. So let's say that there's a project that my team is working on and we don't get it done on time. My instinct is to automatically assume that it's your fault, and not just your fault because you were inattentive, short on time. It's because you're lazy and unmotivated. And that's the overgeneralizing piece. So once we find what the trap is, we can do some pretty simple, concrete things to get around it. Now, there are 7. Some people externalize like I do, other people personalize. We know that some people overgeneralize, as we've just explained, but there are people who fall into pessimism, that's sort of that 3 a.m. thing. There are people who do emotional reasoning. I'm getting anxious, so this must be going to turn out badly. Well, sometimes our emotions aren't reliable barometers. There are people who do mind reading. They expect others to know what they're thinking or think they know what others are thinking. So we'll go through each and every one of these 7. We'll find the one that is the biggest for each person, and then we'll really teach a concrete skill to get around it.
So the 7, I'll just recap the 7 real quick. Those are jumping to conclusions. Number 2 is tunnel vision. Number 3 is magnifying and minimizing. 4 is personalizing. 5 is externalizing. 6 is overgeneralizing. And 7 is mind reading. And I've taken this as well, read through the book, and my predispositions are on mind reading. And I like how you stated some of these kind of go together. So someone that's a mind reader, where if you believe you know what others around you are thinking, then you also tend to be someone that jumps to conclusions. So, and I love how you provide, like you stated, specific solutions for each one to get you past those, or at least to be aware of those and say, okay, I see myself doing this. Here's the corrective action I need to take.
Exactly. And our emotional cues are really good indicators of what traps we fall into. If you're an externalizer, then you're putting blame on other people. So you're going to experience anger because you think they're kind of messing things up for me, which is a violation of my rights, or frustration because you're putting the locus of control outside of yourself. And as we've seen, frustration is an emotion that comes up when we don't think we have the resources to solve a problem. But if you're a personalizer, then you're going to start to experience sadness, guilt, shame, and embarrassment. These are the emotions of the personalizer. If you add overgeneralizing into the mix, then you're going to get big emotions, regardless of which emotion it is. So we can really help people start to map all of these different snapshots we'll take into their thinking style, so that it starts to be a real sort of epiphany of, now I get it. Now I get why I've been reacting this way for the last 20, 30, 40 years. But we don't just leave it there. Self-awareness is critical, but self-awareness without corrective action is largely futile. So we want to talk about some really good concrete skills we can use in each of these instances to get more resilient.
Thank you for providing that. I know that some of those solutions that you provided, especially for the traps that I normally fall into, like with mind reading, learn to speak up, ask questions of others, but first ask yourself, did I make my beliefs or feelings known directly and clearly? Did I convey all the pertinent information? Am I expecting the other person to work hard at figuring out my needs and goals? So just having that self-awareness is so critical, because that allows you to to pause, to reflect, and you get better over time in detecting the traps that you normally fall into, and you catch yourself sooner in real time. And you ask those questions that bring you outside of that trap so that you avoid making them in the future. And it's easier for you to see those inaccurate assumptions, right? That
Absolutely.
you're falling prey to, which if you could just do these things, there's so much more to unpack in this book, but just this piece of it right here, the ABCs, identifying beliefs, whether they're service beliefs, iceberg beliefs, and then going into those thinking traps and identifying the 2 or 3 that you normally fall into, that would be a huge first step in becoming more resilient and building that muscle.
The last thing we want to do in a world of stress and pressure is to add more mental load. So what we really want people to do is to work out what 1 or 2 things they can do a little differently coming out of the workshop. And we want to make it really concrete and specific. We want it to be a stepwise thing. So there's not a lot of guesswork, not a lot of mental load involved. We also believe very strongly in sandwiching these new behaviors into existing behaviors so that you start to habit form. Because what we want is for the skill that we're teaching to become as much of a habit as the bad habit of the trap or the kinds of thinking styles or ticker tape or icebergs that we fall into. And we've had really good success with this. It can be with a little bit of practice every day, a couple of times a week. What we'll see is that it becomes as much of a habit as the bad habits we've developed over time.
Thank you. That's great with habit science. Habit stacking is so important because you're right. You want it to become a habit. You want to incorporate it into your everyday routine. Self-awareness is the first step, but you really want to build upon these tools and tips so that you can be a different person, not fall into these assumptions, these traps moving forward.
And just very quickly, this works wonderfully. Like I have two really bad habits in the morning, first thing. First thing I do is check my phone. And we all know we really shouldn't do that first thing. That's what I do. And then the second thing is I reach for coffee, and it's not going to be the only cup of coffee of the day. So these are two not great habits that I have. And one of the things that I've been doing recently is to make sure that in between those two things, I do a little gratitude meditation. And so at least I'm splicing in something good, a good habit into these two not so great habits.
This concludes this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. You can send us your feedback at info@ims-online.com. If you'd like to subscribe, this podcast can be found both on Apple and Spotify and can also be accessed on the Institute for Management Studies website at ims-online.com. Until next time, remember, it's not what you know, but what you do consistently that makes a difference.